Yeah, so I'm Arjun Patney, and I'm with the American Carbon Registry. We have, by the way, you can see my screen now, right?
Yes, yep, you're full presentation mode.
Okay. Yeah, so we have been, staying abreast of what's going on as much as we can. Those who are actually directly involved in the process, as I understand it, are a bit more restricted in what they can say, but I'm happy to share what we've been learning about the process, and we've been engaged as much as we can. And we were up in Montreal when the deliberations were taking place to figure out what the resolution would look like. So with that, I'm happy to kick this off. Oh, and to give you a bit of background, the American Carbon Registry, in case you don't know, we're an offset project registry. We've been around since '96. We're part of Windrock International, and we started in the voluntary carbon markets, and now most of our activity is in the California cap and trade program. But we're very much interested in playing a role in the international aviation sector as well. So, talk about international aviation and forest carbon. I really wanted to call this airplanes and trees, but I should be a little more serious. So to give you a bit of background, aviation emissions constitute about 2% of global CO2 emissions, and that's growing with the growth in air travel. That translates into about 3 to 5% of warming impact. That's CO2, other emissions, contrails, and the effect of emissions at altitude. Since CODO, international aviation emissions have been carved out from the UNFCCC process, and it's taken a long time for ICAO to really come together with a plan of action. A few years ago, the ES was going to bring flights into and out of the EU under their ETS, and so that really prompted the international community prompted ICAO to get more serious about how they would tackle this issue. So last year, we passed a resolution. I'm hearing some background noise. Is everybody hearing that, or is that just me?
I am seeing it flick back and forth between your picture and another one. If everyone who's not, if everyone on the phone could put themselves on mute, except our speaker, that would be great.
I think I can control that too, so I can mute a noisy person if we need to.
Real life, awesome.
I'll keep an eye on
Great.
that. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Sorry, continue, please.
Thanks. In October of last year, ICAO passed a resolution creating the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA. And that is slated to run from 2021 to 2035. It establishes a goal of carbon neutral growth from 2020, known as CNG20. So that means that CO2 emissions from international aviation are to plateau at 2020 levels, and from there they should be reduced or otherwise mitigated to stay at that level. So this is from ICAO. This illustrates how that goal might be met. Operational improvements are that red sliver there. Things like more advanced air traffic control systems that allow straighter flights would save fuel. Aircraft technology, more fuel efficient engines, that's the blue the blue area there, and other technologies. There was a CO2 standard that was adopted by ICAO pretty recently for new engines, and so things like that will help as well. But the largest slice there is at the bottom, and that's a combination of sustainable alternative fuels and market-based measures. And market-based measures means offsets. So there are efforts out there to there certainly are efforts out there to develop better biofuels and more efficient and economically and cost-effective biofuels. As things are today, as a means of reducing CO2 emissions, offsets are much more inexpensive way of doing that. So as the biofuels technology stands, it looks like offsets would be heavily relied upon to meet the goal of CNG 20. So what does this look like in terms of market size? The market size in 2025 is expected to be in the range of 150 million credits demanded, offsets demanded. By 2035, we get to something between 443 million credits and 596 million, and if the program keeps going, then we could be over 800 million credits demanded per year. So we're, in the later years, we're on the scale of another Kyoto market. The less optimistic and optimistic scenarios vary between the growth in air travel and the effectiveness of mitigation measures from technology and operational improvements and such. So it's a sizable market we're looking at. In terms of dollar figures, the numbers they've come out with are not small, and they're not they're not assuming that what they'll be paying will be 50 cents. So the figures here range at the outset, paying between $6 and $20 per ton, and then in the out years, in 2035, paying between $12 and $40 per ton. So you can see here on the bar chart. So these numbers are in billions of dollars. So in 2025, they're looking at $1.5 billion to $6.2 billion, depending on the scenario. 2030 between 2.9 and 12.4 billion, and 2035 anywhere between 5.3 and 23.9 billion dollars. Only the top two bars there, the 17.7 billion and the 23.9 billion dollars, actually exceed 1% of the total revenue from international aviation. So from what I've seen, IATA has been quite supportive of going forward with this program, the International Air Transport Association, which is the industry group for the carriers, and they appear to have come to the conclusion that it's better to figure out how they'll regulate themselves than to have somebody else do it for them, and that these types of figures are within the ability to incorporate within their business models. Phases and participation. So the first phase, 2021 to 2023, is called a pilot phase, where countries can voluntarily opt in. 2024 to 2026 is called phase 2 and compliance period 1, but it is also on a voluntary basis. When we get to phase 3, 2027 to 2035, that's when countries that are covered by the rules have no choice but to participate. That sounds like, maybe there wouldn't be a lot happening in the first two phases, but that's not what we're seeing, actually. So thank you, Annie, for this. This is a little bit outdated, but I don't think it's changed a whole lot. So this shows the international aviation emissions, and the green portion shows the percentage that is covered, that have opted in the first two phases, and then that are covered on a mandatory basis in the third phase. So we have 65% of emissions covered in the pilot and phase 1 through 2026. So those are the voluntary phases, covering, I think maybe more than 60, a little bit more than that now. Phase 2, 79% covered, and 77% of those emissions covered overall. And so why would countries voluntarily opt in? Well, so for many of these smaller countries, apparently opting in voluntarily may not be that big of a commitment for them if they don't. Least developed countries are exempt, and a number of them may not have a lot of their own international aviation activity. So they may not have carriers of their own who are responsible for much of their emissions. But it might be a carrier from Germany or somebody who does a lot of the flights to and from their country, and if that least developed country volunteers to participate, then those flights between the developed countries and that least developed country become covered by the program. So it's kind of it's in that sense, it's relatively easy for some of these countries to opt into the program. Establishing infrastructure. So through ICAO's process of adopting standards and recommended practices, monitoring, reporting, and verification systems are being figured out and will be implemented. The emissions unit criteria are being figured out, and those are the criteria for the programs and offsets that will be accepted. The resolution that was passed in October of last year does provide explicit support for UN-backed credits, CDM or post-CDM mechanism, but it also, the language is open to other programs as well. ICAO's Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, CAPE, on which Annie participates, is establishing the EUCs, and these standards, these SARPs, are to be agreed by I think September of next year. By middle of next year, they're supposed to adopt those SARPs. So the emissions unit criteria, the EUCs, as I mentioned, they cover criteria for the programs that generate the offsets. So some of the things that have to be covered are there are clear methodologies and protocols, validation and verification procedures, avoidance of double counting claims. Offset credits have to be the basic criteria for credible credits. They have to be additional, based on realistic and credible baseline, have to be permanent emissions reductions, etc. Some of the challenges arising are avoiding double counting with the NDCs, and figuring out how that potential double counting would actually be managed, the mechanics of that. Figuring out the emissions unit criteria, the EUCs that I mentioned. Establishing how emissions would be tracked. From what we've seen, and some of us were down in Miami back in March with AIDA and IATA, and with some of the airlines. And we saw that some of the, for example, some of the US airlines that had done flights solely within Europe have robust systems for tracking their emissions that they just need to scale up for this, and so they feel pretty good about that. But many other carriers from other parts of the world that don't have flights within the EU haven't had to create those types of tracking systems. So that, and then so taking it from that level to tracking those emissions in registries and squaring those up with offsets, that infrastructure has to be created. And then there's the issue of the ongoing deferment of coverage by the EU ETS, and the EC has been officially maintaining a wait-and-see attitude, deferring coverage, but looking at what ICAO comes out with. Forest carbon opportunities. So we're quite hopeful here that ACR would be part of the program. In forest carbon, we have, for domestic forest carbon, we have methodologies for improved forest management for non-federal U.S. forest lands and afforestation and reforestation of degraded lands. So that's my plug for ACR, and of course other programs have their protocols as well. And internationally, both ACR and BCS have methodologies, although my understanding is that the acceptance of red credits is still an issue that is being deliberated and decided, and it's not clear to me, from my perspective, whether those will be accepted, and if they are, whether there would be some window early on during which they'd be accepted, or whether that would be accepted on an ongoing basis. So there are definitely some intersections with forest carbon, and on the whole, it's potentially quite a large opportunity. So that's what I have to share with you today, and I'm happy to take any questions.